Basically, I've been asked to speak on the impact of aging on shared growth and equity. And I think it might be useful to start off with graphs which you have already seen many times this morning and today. And basically what I think it is important for us to recognize is that increasingly children, to put it in economic terms, children used to be seen as inferior goods. So as you got better off, you had less children, to put it very crudely. But more seriously, I think what we have is a situation where you have families with less children, partly because the likelihood of child mortality is diminished. Also, very importantly, children are less likely to be used to contribute to incomes at an early age, less child labor. And very importantly also, the expectation that children will provide for their parents in their old age may have diminished over time. This, however, may well change in the future. Now, in this regard, I think it is important for us to recognize that, as everybody has pointed out, people are living longer, and some of these increases are quite dramatic. But it's also important to examine why people are living longer, and people are not necessarily living longer in good health. And this is, I think, very important. There was an observation made earlier about the impact of non-communicable diseases, for instance. And there are a number of communicable diseases as well, which older people may tend to be more vulnerable to. And all this has to be taken into consideration. So the imposition of higher burdens, economic burden for the time being, on society tends to grow with this changing dependency ratios. Now, if we look further, one will see that there have been some important changes within the Asia-Pacific region, and the age profile in Asia has changed rather dramatically. But I think it's important for us to recognize that even though there are important changes, it is very likely, given the developments in public health and given the developments in medicine, that the likelihood of life expectancies going up are fairly significant. It should be noted, however, that the most dramatic drop in life expectancy actually occurred at the end of the 20th century. Russian male life expectancy dropped by 6 years in the first 4 years of the Yeltsin presidency. This is incredible. The output of the Russian economy dropped by half. And only 3 years ago, did Russian economic output reach its levels before Yeltsin. So one can see that these processes are not necessarily irreversible, and one needs to recognize that one cannot assume that people will necessarily always continue to be better off. This is especially important to recognize given the likelihood that we are going to soon reach a tipping point as far as global warming is concerned. And for some societies in particular, this may well have catastrophic effects. I'm thinking, for example, about some countries in Asia, such as the Maldives or Bangladesh. Much of the Sundarbans, for example, in Bangladesh, are likely to be inundated just with a very relatively modest increase in sea levels. Also, much of the mangroves, which are so important to fish life, are likely to be compromised in quality, and the ability to support marine life is likely to be compromised. And this will have very important consequences for the human intake of animal protein. because 70% of human intake of animal protein comes from fish rather than from livestock or poultry. So all these are very important, and we do need to recognize Asia's vulnerability, and Asia's vulnerability should be seen in larger context. And so the challenges posed by aging have to be seen in this larger context. Now let us quickly remember that the current thinking, and I want to commend HelpAge in particular for contributing to this. The current thinking is actually a significant departure from much of the thinking about social policy which characterized the last couple of decades of the 20th century. In that period, very much under the influence of Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan, there was a very significant change in thinking about social policy. In fact, Mrs. Thatcher famously told us that there is no such thing as society, that it is the individual which is supreme, and one should begin to think primarily in those terms. Now, economists don't have a problem with that because we have been trained to think in terms of the optimizing behavior of the individual. But having said that, I think it is important to recognize that Asia has also had other very important consequences. If you look at most surveys about social protection, for instance, you will find that Asia is often considered to be very backward. But if you look more carefully, you will actually see a great deal which has happened in Asia, which has actually been quite pioneering. The chair of the next session, for instance, was served in a company called Tata. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Tata was probably the first company in the world to introduce what might be called a corporate social welfare system. Okay, it pioneered what was done by the ancestors of Mr. Tata in the first company town, which was established in India, was actually unheard of in the West. And this, I think, is important for us to recognize. So there are many things which have happened in Asia, and Asia, of course, accounts for over 60% of the world's population, which have actually been quite innovative, quite original. And I think it is important for us to begin to recognize that because we have different names for different phenomena in different systems, it doesn't mean that for example, welfare systems or social protection systems do not necessarily exist. So the idea of a bifurcated system of relying on the state for what were considered to be poor services basically comes out of this 1980s, and that it was commercial services which would pay for themselves essentially, which were basically for those who could afford it. And the ideology of means testing became important. Now, I want to emphasize that although means testing has been promoted by a whole range of international agencies, World Bank, including the World Bank, it is the World Bank's own research from about a decade and a half ago, which actually showed that means testing in general, and there are important exceptions, means testing in general suffers from what are called type 1 and type 2 errors. And the type 1 and type 2 errors basically means that there are many people who might qualify who do not qualify because of the nature of the testing procedure. Or alternatively, you will also have people who do not qualify, who should not qualify, who qualify because of the nature of the means test. Also, additionally, we find that most forms of means testing tend to be very expensive. And this is another important consideration. So and very importantly, for those of you who believe that we live in democratic societies and that the citizen has rights in democratic societies, having a two-tier system basically is not good for democracy. It's not good for if you really believe that for a sense of citizenship, if you will. And all this, I think, are important considerations when you think about alternative means of organizing social protection systems. Now, One of the big challenges which has come up in the last decade and a half is whether or not in the process of providing protection or assistance or whatever you may wish to call it, particularly to the age, this should be conditional. And there are there's a very important argument, and you'll find that in Latin America in particular, most famously in the case of Oportunidades in Mexico and previously known as Progresa, I think, and in the case of Bolsa Familia and its antecedents in the case of Brazil, there have been conditional cash transfers. And I think particularly in the Brazilian case, and I don't know how long that will last now that Dilma Rousseff has been ousted, but particularly in the Brazilian case, you will find that much of the conditionality is conditionality which most of us, I think, would find quite acceptable from a moral point of view. The conditionality, for instance, that the children should be vaccinated against certain diseases and so on and so forth, in order for the family, the woman, the mother, to qualify for disbursements. But on the other hand, you also find situations where the conditionalities imposed are actually driven by certain ideological or political presumptions, which have very little basis in terms of enhancing the general welfare of the population. And there, I think, one might have much more serious concerns. So it is very important, therefore, to assess the likely effects of conditionalities before making a prior judgment as to how to proceed, because it is quite widespread that people just presume that conditionalities are necessarily desirable. Do people necessarily need behavioral incentives? Now, this is becoming very popular because there has been the rise of behavioral economics, particularly in the since the turn of the century, and some of the major development assistance agencies, such as DFID in the United Kingdom, are now very, very heavily committed to these experiments involving behavioral incentives. But one should have cast a much more critical eye as to the implications, the desirability, and the efficacy of such behavioral incentives before presuming that they work. Moving on very quickly, I think it is important for us to also assess the costs of imposing conditions. The costs can be very, very considerable, as I suggested earlier in the case of means testing as well. Now, let me address a question which is often raised, that perhaps we should prioritize the age last in terms of the social protection priorities. And the presumption here is that it's kind of wasted on the age because they are no longer productive in members of society, and they're unlikely to become much more productive members of society. But if we look at the record in most societies, we find that the older poor, for example, who receive cash transfers, to use one particular example, that the older poor tend to share their excess, if you will, transfers with their families, with the younger ones. The older people tend to be tremendously altruistic, unlike, for example, the male heads of households, if you compare with mothers, for example. I'm mentioning this because in the case of the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, disbursements are made through the mother, not through the father. Okay, so the so-called presumption that you disburse through the head of household doesn't hold in the case of Bolsa Familia. But as far as grandparents are concerned, you'll find that grandparents generally are actually very altruistic, and they may even sacrifice their own welfare, if you will, in the interest of their grandchildren. So I think the evidence of this is quite widespread. It seems to be quite cross-cultural, and I think it holds up to critical scrutiny. Now, so this is also true, as I was hinting earlier, in the case of Zambia. Zambia is a relatively poor society in southern Africa, and this is the case there. Now, let me turn to the question of how much it would cost to have a very, very modest old age pension. We're not talking about the financing of the pension, the old age pension of $1 a day in over 100 countries. And this was something which we did after the Madrid Plan of Action was approved about a decade ago, and after the approval of the Madrid Plan of Action, the cost of universal old age pensions of $1 a day. Okay, why $1 a day? Simply because this was the so-called poverty line, which was adopted by the World Bank, and which has become, which has been kind of universalized as a consequence of that. And the result is that what we found is that the actual costs for developing countries, and we're talking about developing countries here, of such a modest, very modest pension to keep all people out of extreme poverty, okay, was actually very, very little, okay? And when the ILO, the International Labour Organization, did estimates it's of a universal old age and disability pensions, okay? So it added disability as well, and you'll find that, again, you find that it was generally less than 1.5% for the countries which were surveyed, except in the case of Nepal, at that time considered to be one of the poorest countries. In the case of Nepal, it was slightly over 2%, and in the case of Ethiopia, then considered one of the 3 poorest countries in the world, it was slightly over 1.5%. Okay, so you'll find that what might seem at first blush to be a luxury is actually quite affordable. Okay, let me move on to look at the question of affordability much more carefully. Generally speaking, if you look at how national budgets are prepared, what is called social spending comprises a very relatively small part of national budgets, and much of it tends to go to education and tends to go to health. Depending on the country, in the case of my country, Malaysia, there is a great deal which goes to education. But actually the efficacy and the impact of the Malaysia's spending on education is actually quite poor compared, for example, with Malaysia's spending on health. Malaysia's spending on health is actually quite efficient, and we find that Malaysia used to be among the top 3 as far as health indicators are concerned in Asia, at least until the 1980s. And this was done on with a relatively smaller share of the budget. Why? Because of the way the public health system was organized and how effectively this was done. Now, what we also find is that countries which have different income levels actually spend differing amounts, wildly differing amounts on social expenditure. So ultimately, the key issue is really political. It's a question of political will, okay? And whether or not a country chooses to spend money on for social expenditure, and what proportion of that social expenditure accrues to the aged. Now, I mentioned earlier that that some of the poorest countries and some of the poorest countries in the world have now developed in the last, at least since the turn of the century, they have developed particular forms of social protection, partly thanks to the influence of the World Bank, and its promotion of the Latin American conditional cash transfers, you find that in Africa too, cash transfers have become very important. In many African countries, they are not necessarily conditional though, and sometimes they are unconditional cash transfers, but you will find that some of the poorest societies in the world, many of which are to be found in Africa, are involved in providing cash transfers. These include countries like Ethiopia, includes countries like Malawi, Somalia, and Zambia, and so on. So you'll find that these schemes have been shown to actually be sustainable, okay? Especially when they have been homegrown. Okay, the ones which are tied to aid are often not particularly sustainable, but when they are homegrown, they have proved to be quite sustainable. So it's very, very important that you have a strong sense of national political commitment to sustaining these schemes, and certainly affordability tends to follow. This does not mean that there are no problems, okay? And I want to recognize that a package for providing such pensions could cost up to 5% of GDP. My earlier examples suggested much less, but it could go up to about 5% of GDP. And it's important, therefore, for us to recognize that some of the poorest societies in the world today collect less than 10% of national income in the form of taxes. Yeah, less than 10%. And why is this the case? Because half their taxes disappeared when they committed to trade liberalization, because tariffs were one of the easiest forms of taxation to collect. Okay, so what happened was when they liberalized their trade, they basically lost half their taxation. So you will find that some of the poorest societies in the world collect less than 10%, and this basically means that when you have 10% on a very low national income, you have virtually nothing. Consider, for example, that the average tax level which the German citizen pays is 53%. Okay, 53%. So when you're talking about, let us say, 9% on a miserable level of national income, we are talking about very, very little money. Okay, so for some of these societies, I think you cannot have very much. Okay, you can have a very, very basic pension, but you cannot have very much without supplementation through international solidarity. Okay, that sort of goes without saying in a way. Now, we also need to recognize why there is no money. Okay, and besides the loss of tariff income, I think it is very important to recognize that some of the policies which have been adopted in the last 30 years or so have been disastrous for many developing countries. Okay, in Malaysia there was an economist. Well, he died many years ago, but he wrote a book in 1960 when he was in jail in Singapore, and he wrote a book, and he basically said that the policy which he didn't talk about financial liberalization, but basically he said opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly in than to fly out is delusion of the highest order. Okay, and this is basically what developing countries did. Okay, you had international financial liberalization, expecting funds to flow in rather than to flow out. So the consequence of this has been massive outflow of illicit finance. And last year, I think it was, Thabo Mbeki, the former South African president, was the chair of an African Union Commission, which was set up looking at international financial flows. And what did they find? They found that the illicit financial flows out of Africa, okay, were greater than not only all the ODA, but also all the FDI. ODA plus FDI coming into Africa. Okay? So this is basically the net effect of pursuing, on the one hand, trade liberalization, on the other hand, international financial liberalization. So these are some of the problems, and they cannot be easily overcome, but they need to be overcome if some of these problems are going to be addressed. So let us recognize that, true, there's not much fiscal space, but the fiscal space does exist even in the poorest countries. And much needs to be done to try to ensure that this is realized. I won't get into some of the economic measures which will be needed because that will take us far afield, but I think it is important for us to recognize that there are, and many of you, even those working in government, are not directly involved in some of these matters, but it is important to recognize that there are many measures which can be pursued. Somebody was asking me as I was coming in earlier about why I'm critical of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this country, Vietnam, is the only country of the 12 countries where public opinion favors the TPP. And I quite understand why Vietnam favors the TPP, because of its problems with the United States before they were at war with the United States until 41 years ago, and there are still some non-tariff barriers which Vietnam faces with the United States. But additionally, they are having some problems with the neighbor to the north, and this has become a means. So the TPP has been driven politically, but if you look at what the TPP promises, very little in terms of gains from trade liberalization, but very importantly, strengthening of intellectual property rights. What does this basically mean? It basically means that the cost of medicines, okay, to all of us, not just the aged, but the aged are particularly in need of medicines, is inevitably going to go up. Because basically you have the strengthening of intellectual property rights, which basically means extending patents, evergreening of patents, patents being provided for what are called biologics. Naturally occurring substances can be patented now, and so on and so forth. All this is going to change. And at the end of last year, the USTR went to Nairobi for the WTO ministerial on the Doha Development Round, and basically told the Doha Development Round that we should not continue with this Doha agenda. We changed the agenda to follow what the TPP has offered. So we have a huge problem on our hands. We don't see any progress and resolution to all this, and many of the problems are actually due to bad advice being provided. In the case of a neighboring country to Kenya, in the case of Tanzania, you have a situation where Tanzania is now the third largest gold producer in Africa. Okay? And guess how much the contribution to Tanzanian revenue has been from gold mining? Well, that's a trick question, because the answer is that it's been negative, because Tanzania has actually been subsidizing gold mining. And I spoke to the former World Bank the chief head of mission in Tanzania, and he told me, well, we were trying to avoid corruption and so on and so forth. Well, the net result is that you basically have a situation where the gold mining companies are being subsidized by the Tanzanian government with a lot of other adverse consequences. So I was very heartened this morning to read in the Vietnamese newspapers that the former head of the Foreign Investment Agency in Vietnam is asking to reconsider, the contribution of FDI, considering, for example, its consequences in terms of national sovereignty as well as in terms of the environment. So there is hope, but let me move on. So the point, I think, has been made time and again, that you basically have that poor developing countries can afford social protection. If the problem is that of political will, then why should politicians, and I'm very glad that this conference has been organized with politicians, with parliamentarians here, actively here. Because when I organized the conference, the second international conference on nutrition in Rome in 2014, we had a special session for parliamentarians It was actually held 200 meters from where Caesar was killed by Brutus and Cassius. So I tried to make a joke about, please don't adopt the policy change methods of Mr. Cassius and Mr. Brutus, but it got lost in translation. Anyway, the point is this, that there are political reasons why politicians should support financing for this. And this include the fact that political surveys generally suggest that old people tend to be appreciative for those who look at who consider their concerns, and it's very important not only to win electoral support, that older people tend to show up for elections and vote and take their vote very, very much more seriously than younger people, and so on and so forth. So the question of political will is extremely important, and that, I think, is very important, and this is why I think the organizers of this conference have to be commended for ensuring that the politicians are here as well. I think it is very important also to recognize that there are a universal approach should be rights-based, and that makes it definitely much more politically acceptable. If you start discriminating and you say, oh, only if your income is this and that, therefore you can qualify, you basically turn off people who are excluded. And once certain people are excluded, then you narrow the political support for such a measure. So targeting also, as I mentioned earlier, tends to be expensive and it misses many people. So there is a need, however, as I suggested earlier, for us to increase our tax revenues. Dr. Park will be addressing this in a while, but I think it is very important to recognize that there are all kinds of sources of taxes which need to be, where there needs to be progress. Unfortunately, last year, before the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, there was a very important conference on financing for development. And there was a reluctance, unfortunately a refusal, of the OECD countries to support the G77. G77 is the caucus of developing countries. The G77 request for stronger international tax cooperation. If you do not have stronger international tax cooperation, it will be very difficult in the modern world to stop leakages. So it becomes extremely important that you have that kind of international cooperation. I think the appetite for this is here now, because many countries, many developed countries, are beginning to see this. Look, consider for a moment President Obama's expressions of outrage at what is called inversion, tax inversion involving Ireland. Irish companies, US companies relocating to register in Ireland simply for tax avoidance purposes. Consider the outrage which Germans feel about tax avoidance in Luxembourg and Liechtenstein and so on and so forth. So you have an appetite for this in the West, you have an appetite for this in Japan, and I think this is the time really to push for greater international cooperation on taxation, and I do hope that Dr. Park will also address these issues. And we need, of course, to try to eliminate, or at least reduce the illicit financial flows which have become far, far more rampant with global financial globalization in recent years. Now, one big challenge is that when you look at income distribution, and this addresses the question of equity, which I've been asked to address, the big problem with income distribution is that when you think about income distribution, you really think about intra-nation income distribution. Okay, when Thomas Piketty, for example, published his book 2 years ago, everybody was enthusiastic about it. They thought they were thinking about income distribution within these societies. But when you really think about income inequality at the global level, income inequality at the global level actually involves inter-country differences as well. In fact, somewhere between 2/3 to 70% of global income inequality is between countries, and only 30% to about 33% is intra-country, okay, in the larger scheme of things. And so we really need to begin to think about how some of these international differences need to be addressed. You cannot explain all this in a way in terms of different levels of productivity and so on and so forth. There are other mechanisms at work which we need to begin to address. And this is why I think that at least for temporarily, it is very important for there to be adequate budget support, including through international development assistance, to enable the financing of the pensions which we were referring to earlier. And of course, there is a need to reallocate public expenditures. I don't think Asians should be proud of the fact that we have seen a big increase in military expenditures in recent years. This is not something for Asians to be proud of. And I also think it is very unfortunate that private consumption patterns in many countries also leave something to be desired. Let me turn quickly to a few slides. I'll run through them very quickly about the situation in my own country, Malaysia, because it was easier to get more contemporary figures. Basically, life expectancy has increased tremendously, as you can see here, and this is true of many other countries in Asia. We can see how life expectancies have changed. Malaysians are also having far fewer children, and so this changes the dependency ratios, but it also changes the future prospects of societies in ways which have already been discussed by earlier speakers. And I think it is important to recognize that the population structure of society is likely to change in ways like this. Many other societies are going to experience this as well. And I think, and finally, basically we have this shifting dependency ratios, which I already referred to more generally, which are also taking place in Malaysia. Now, let me conclude by, I think there are two things for us to remember about lifestyle changes. Malaysia now has the highest car population per capita in Asia. I live in Malaysia, I live in the city, and frankly, it is not something I'm very proud of. Okay, the traffic jams, the time you waste getting and the quality of life of the air pollution index in the Klang Valley where I live is nothing which I would see as particularly good. But the other thing, of course, is the kind of expenditure which goes on, and we have seen some progress recently with the withdrawal of subsidies, as should be the case in Bangladesh too, of withdrawal of fuel subsidies, and this withdrawal of the reduction of the sugar subsidy. And one of the consequences, of course, is the fact that in Malaysia now in Asia also has the highest incidence of overweight and obesity, and the highest incidence of diabetes. And earlier, I think Pip referred to the NCDs, or maybe Professor Kazemi as well, diet-related non-communicable diseases, which are extremely important in influencing life expectancy, and very importantly as well, the quality of life. Thank you very much for your attention.